We advise the opinions and views of the hosts and guests do not reflect those of the station.
You are what you watch.
Hello, my name's Tambuatco and welcome to our program. As we start and unfold with the topic for this program, let's talk about government, because that's where we're going to go today. But what do we know and what exactly is government? Ladies and gentlemen, government was not born in a day, for those of you who don't know that. Alam mo, ang pagbubukas ng gobyerno, hindi basta-basta day one, ayan na lahat, and everything is in order. No, it doesn't work that way. Government has had to evolve over decades. Over the many decades, government, just like its people, the citizenry, has had to evolve with it. And evolving means over time. So what happens? Well, government introduces committees, departments, etc., etc. These are all supposedly service groups, service committees, service advocacies, etc., etc., to help government serve the people. The people on the other side have to play the body politic through their role, let's say through their own barangays, their congressmen, their representatives, etc., to be the body politic, to be part of this process. People who scream out in the street and say they just want change, but don't know exactly what their changes are almost, let's see, absent-minded, not realizing the work of government. To truly appreciate government, one has to sort of study it. Now, I'm not asking you to go to public administration and governance, etc., but to know how exactly it works will make you at least appreciate the work of government. Marami sa atin, reklamo lang ng reklamo, hindi naman alam kung ano ang lumalabas, kung paano pinatatakbong gobyerno at paano lahat yan. Hindi naman basta, ito mukhang korupto, tirahin na natin yan. Hindi pwede rin yan eh. There's what you call rule of law. There are specific procedures. In our democracy, we have to follow specific guidelines, policies, well, what you call civility. And without all of this, we are reduced to nothing but animals. And animals, when you're hungry, you prowl out, you grab the nearest whatever you can grab, you put in your mouth and you consume. In this case, there is what you call civility and there is order. In government, it was created over many, many decades through this civility, through this order, and through what we call the coding system or what you call law. Today, we're going to talk about the President Commission on Human Rights. I bet you're probably going to think, Eta Rosales. No, no, no. That's exactly what came to my mind. But no, it's not. It's something different. I didn't realize we even had a committee of this sort. To introduce our guest, we have our co-host with us, Dr. John Teope, who you already know has been in the show the last 6 weeks, who will introduce to us our guest. John?
Hello, great day. Hello, everybody. Mga kaibigan, when Harry and I was talking about human rights, we have a lot of names in common, but at this point, we invited somebody who's really a heavyweight pertaining to human rights advocacy. And in terms of heavyweight, he is full of substance when it comes to discussions pertaining to human rights. So our guest is really in government service. For so many years, he's been 23 years in government service. He's a career official. And prior to government service, he was with the Forum for Rural Concerns and ran Researches and Analysts Incorporated. He's a former executive director of the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process. And at present, he is the executive director of the Presidential Human Rights Committee with the rank of undersecretary. He was also a Huwarang Filipino awardee for Peace and Order, and this was in 2004. And he was a graduate of UP batch 1987 mass communication. So mga kaibigan, pakilala natin ang sinasabi kong heavyweight pagdating sa human rights, si Undersecretary Severo S. Catura, the Executive Director of the Presidential Human Rights Committee. Good day, Usec.
Maraming salamat. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Dr. Jan, Harry, good afternoon.
Salamat. Thank you very much for being in our show. Director, how do I call you? Executive Director, Usec. Ano mas maganda?
Under the Administrative Order 163, which governs the current existence of the Presidential Human Rights Committee, the Secretariat is headed by an Executive Director with the rank of an Undersecretary.
So, Executive Director po?
Yes, opo.
ED.
Opo,
Ano tawag niya? ED?
Well, depende ho. Sa ibang opisina, it's called IDIR. So
IDIR.
parang DIR naman masyado. So ED na lang.
ED.
Nonoy.
Nonoy. ED Nonoy. Please explain to us in very mild terms your concept or the President Commission, the Committee on Human Rights, the concept of human rights per se.
Okay. Maganda rin yata umpisa natin from...
Siguro, Harry, mas maganda kung you would start, paano ba na-create muna yung Presidential Human Rights Committee, the history?
Sige. Mas maganda yan para to bring it up to par on what it is. Sige.
Well, malayo-layo ito, ano? Kasi we're talking about a post-EDSA People Power One scenario, no? Kung maaalala natin noon, we came from a dictatorship, supposedly the dark years of dictatorship. So, one of the most immediate concerns of the then Cory Aquino administration was to look into human rights violations. No? So, in 1986, the president, since the Constitution was still being crafted, came out with an executive order creating the Human Rights Committee. At that time, in 1986, it was composed of human rights personalities, no? Not institutions unlike today. So we had the likes of Kapa Pejokno, Sister Jan Manansan, Justice J.B.L. Reyes. So when the new constitution came about, and the creation of a Commission on Human Rights was specifically stated there, the Human Rights Committee created by the President somehow evolved into something else. It became an executive body rather than an independent commission. So, which actually segues to what's the difference between the current Commission on Human Rights?
Yes, that's my next question, obviously.
That's right. Under the Constitution, we have an independent National Human Rights Institution. So that's the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, which actually monitors the human rights compliance of all entities in government, regardless of whether it's the executive or the judiciary or the legislative. Now, the Presidential Human Rights Committee is very much focused on what does the executive do, the executive department do.
Just executive?
Yes, opo. Nakatutok lang kami dun sa
so para kayong ombudsman ng executive ng government.
Yes.
Ng executive, legislative,
yes,
and everybody else. Kayo yung parang ombudsman on human rights.
On the executive department lang. Kasi we have
on the executive department.
Ang CHR, pangkalahatan siya.
Pangkalahatan. Sige.
They monitor compliance, while we in the PHRC, we ensure compliance.
Okay. Who has the police power? CHR o kayo?
Well, the police powers come from being part of or being a coordinative body. So we monitor the actions being undertaken by the different member agencies of the committee.
How about jurisdictional conflicts? Do you experience jurisdictional conflicts between the CHR and the PHRC?
Well, admittedly, there are certain very gray areas with regards to that. But over time, we have somehow hurdled yung questions na yan. But when it comes to human rights education, it's the realm of the CHR. The implementation in terms of government action, that's the realm of the PHRC.
Okay. So sa executive talaga kayo?
Nakatutok.
Ongoing, nakatutok.
Okay.
Yes,
Government action and education. So what kind of actions being done by the PHRC and the CHR's education? Anong ginagawa nyo in terms of action?
Well, sa ngayon, meron kaming ang tinututukan na. Well, one, we have to understand that the committee is supposed to be an advisory body to the President. It has its own set of members, member agencies. And we have our mandate. Well, over the years, the mandate has evolved into something very specific that has to be responsive to the needs of the times. So right now, what we are focused on is coming up with a National Human Rights Action Plan. This is supposed to be the the template for how government should be able to comply with its human rights obligations, its various human rights obligations. And these human rights obligations are not simply limited to what we know before as yung mga civil and political rights, violations against, yung arbitrary detention, we have torture.
That's all enshrined in the Constitution anyway, all
Yes,
of these
that's correct,
issues.
that's correct. Oo. Pero sa amin kasi, ang isa pang tinitingnan namin dito is not only within existing laws and statutes. It's also how we respond to the core international human rights treaties which we have signed over the years. So one of the things that we are also looking at is how do we harmonize what we have signed in these international covenants, harmonize in relation to our domestic laws.
Okay, Usec, as I understand, the Presidential Human Rights Commission committee was enacted through an executive order.
Yes, it was.
So, bakit hindi siya na-abolish when the Commission on Human Rights was established?
In other words, after the revolutionary government in 87
Yeah.
and the new constitution was enacted,
Yeah.
it evolved and it's still evolving,
Yeah.
but it's become more distinct
Yeah.
in its role.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's correct.
Parang ganun ang nangyari.
Oo. Actually, sa totoo lang, hindi ko na alam kung bakit. Pero parang tinanggap na lamang na nag-evolve siya. Actually, ang nangyari dyan, perhaps I think at the time when President Cory Aquino decided to retain the committee, I think what she wanted was, teka muna, yung ginawa kong committee naging independent na under the Constitution. I need to have a body that should be able to advise me directly.
Within the executive.
So there came a point na, in fact, this was even assigned to the Department of
Tsaka
Justice.
you could not easily abolish it kasi the executive order during that time is equivalent to a statute, di ba?
That's correct.
So, kailangan amendment.
Dapat may amendment. Pero ang nag-amend lang ito, kung hindi ako nagkakamali, mga EOs na lamang.
EOs na lang.
Pero over time, nagkaroon siya ng maraming amendments kasi nagdagdag ng mga members. Depende kasi doon sa nakikita nila na nagiging problema over nung panahon ni President Ramos, nagkaroon din nung panahon ni President Arroyo, nagkaroon din ng pagbabago.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I was saying in the introduction. The evolution of government is not necessarily static. It never remains the same, and it's not supposed to. The corrections, the amendments, the whatever innovations that are being introduced is because of the times and the requirement of the times. It also has to do with the advocacies and whatnot of the sitting president and administration. Understanding government will help us understand how the administrative or the government or the president works. These are different departments that evolve over time to make us understand how they make decisions. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's go now to the concept of the word
Human rights.
Kasi, alam mo, marami yan. Kasi, alam mo, human rights, my gosh, there's so many questions. We can hit those questions on the second part of the show. But, Edie, how would you, in a nutshell, describe human rights? Yan.
Well,
you're the man who sits there.
Siguro, what's the generally accepted definition of human rights?
Well, ang simple para sa ating mga mamayan, ang dapat maunawaan, kung ikaw ay isang human being, meron ka mga karapatan dahil ikaw ay isang human being.
Tama.
No? So, yan ang pinaka-basic definition ng human rights. Your rights because you are a human being. No? Kaya human rights siya. And then, meron din tayong nakalagay dyan. Well, universal. No? So, ito ay hindi kinikilala dito kung anong kasarian, kung anong nationality, dapat non-discriminatory. Although there are certain things that we call na
national rights.
Well, national rights, kung ito yung pwede nung sabihin na national rights as against collective rights, etc. No?
Dami niya, may moral rights pa. Batas, marami yan eh.
Actually, kung titingnan natin, Harry, kasi over time nga, sabi ko nga, nag-evolve din yung ating set of rights over the decades. No? In fact, naging 60th year na yung pagpirma noong Universal Declaration natin. Oo. And kahit yun, ay nakita ng mga magagaling sa batas. Sa international na batas. Na, teka muna, kailangan pala natin maging specific. Kaya nga tayo, we have several core international human rights treaties like meron tayong on racial discrimination, with, against women, yes, children. Ito yung mga yung pinakahuli nga, yung pinirmahan natin yung sa rights of persons with disabilities.
Disability,
Oo, marami ito, mga migrant workers' rights. So, nagiging very specific siya. Oo.
So you cannot just say human rights, rights of a specific human being, not necessarily. So it's the study of all the different rights put together and advising the president every time. So kung nagka-cabinet meeting, kailan doon kayo?
Well, ideally po dapat nandun. Pero under the scenario right now, since the committee is being chaired by the executive secretary, so his presence in the
So kay Mr.
security
Ochoa
council-
kayo?
Yes,
So you meet with Mr. Ochoa, he's the head of the Presidential
Human
Rights
Rights
Committee.
yes, we have our way of communicating with him, various ways of communicating with him.
How about, let's see, you know, this week it's interesting. Is it this week or is it last week wherein Newsweek celebrates the week or the month of women all over the world and women's rights all over the world and the role of women in the last 60 years. In the last 6 decades, women have taken top positions all over the world. Things have changed. However, by the same token, women are still being punished and enslaved in many parts of the world, especially well, even in Saudi Arabia. They're not even allowed to have a driver's license. Di ba? Parang ganun eh. And yet, there are women now taking presidencies and prime ministerships and whatnot all over the world. The latest being in Brazil, di ba, just recently. Now, the rights of women in this country is one of the big issues nga is what you call the trafficking of women. A big issue. And then there is what you call the assessment or how they grade us internationally when it comes to human rights. I don't exactly have the exact ratings in my mind, but if I'm not mistaken, we are not faring very well there. Why is that the case? Considering we have CHR, we have a very active, I mean, this is the best situation. The previous CHR commissioner is now DOJ. And then you've got Eta Rosales, who was extreme left in the last presidency, who is now sitting as CHR. Then you also have the Ateneo Law School, di ba, who has the human rights advocacy. Well, with Mr. Medina, but well, you know, he's incapacitated at this point. He was the guy in the Truth Commission. But and then you have the Presidential Commission, Presidential Human Rights
Committee.
Committee.
Yeah.
How is it we cannot check our human rights status or assessment? How would you assess our human rights? It's a better question to ask.
Well, in the last 3 decades after martial law, no, I think we need to set some parameters here.
Yes,
no?
yes.
Kasi,
Fair.
Oo. Makikita natin na nagkaroon din ng paunti-unting evolution na nagkakaroon tayo ng consciousness na, hey, human rights is very much alive pala. No?
Pero Usec, in terms of human rights, palagi na lang pumapasok sa kaisipan natin, yung sinisigaw is human rights violations. Palaging negative ang aspeto ng human rights eh.
Actually, Doc, hindi mo rin talaga masisi. Kasi nga dumaan tayo dun sa isang madilim na bahagi ng ating kasaysayan. No? So talaga na-equate siya sa torture, enforces appearance.
Kasi human rights is supposed to be positive, di ba?
Ang kagandahan ngayon, sabi ko nga, dahil nag-i-evolve nga ito over the years, so doon tayo pumapasok sa broadening of the concepts of human rights. Like for instance, kasi titingnan natin, meron tinatawag na mga generation of rights. Yung first generation of rights are basically the civil and political rights. Ito yung mga doon pumapasok yung ating mga
Batas.
yung mga nakikita natin talaga pinaglalaban ng ating mga kaibigan sa kalsada. Yung second generation naman, dito nakatutok ito sa socio-economic and cultural rights.
Yeah.
Oo. Ang sinasabi nga nila, yung the first generation of rights na yan, ay kuminsan, ito yung tinututukan ng mga first world countries. Itong second generation, ito yung mga non-aligned countries na nakatutok sa kanilang economic development. So we have China, we have India, we have ano. Ang third generation of rights, ito yung right to development, right to peace. Ito daw yung concern ng mga third world countries at developing countries tulad natin. No? So, sa atin, kung makikita natin, yung pag-evolve ng rights na ito, ay ayon talaga doon sa ating pag-grow din eh. Yung ating
Sa ating evolution.
Oo, sa ating evolution.
Edie, we're going to have to take a short break. We're right in the bottom of the hour. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us as we unfold what exactly we mean by what we call human rights and how far can that go. Like Executive Director told us, it depends also, and it evolves on the country where it is also established and where awareness generation is also being practiced. So stay with us, and more on human rights as we come back.
Hello, everybody. On the first part of our program, we discussed about some points pertaining to the Presidential Human Rights Committee, and most of you are now aware that there's such a thing as a Presidential Human Rights Committee. And most of it pertaining to how the Presidential Human Rights Committee evolved, our guests will already discuss it. And sa ngayon po ay siguro we go to some technicalities pertaining to what is really a human rights and what is a human rights violation and what are the parameters on human rights. Siguro, Harry, would you like to start the question?
Yeah. No, before we go to the questions on this second segment, I'd like to give the opportunity to Edie to continue before I cut it short on the first segment, because my question then was, how do we rate ourselves in the international realm of human rights? Because somehow my perception is we don't rate very well when it comes to human rights. Now, how I got that perception, obviously it's media, no? Or either the left was so strong in the last administration, now that the left is sitting in the administration,
so they're the right.
perception is still the same, that there's something wrong with their human rights. But how do we assess ourselves on behalf of all the different countries of the world? You were beginning to say before I cut you off in the last part, na in every country there are different assessments on human rights.
That's right.
Allow it to finish that.
Anyway, thank you very much, Harry. Actually, yung observation mo with regards to how it came about are all true.
Okay.
Anyway,
tama rin pala yun.
kasi ano yan depende yan doon sa sitwasyon na kung saan ilalagay yung pag-observe natin, pag-comply. In fact, nung pumirma tayo doon sa tinatawag natin mga core international treaties, very clear doon yung tinatawag na principle of progressive realization. So, hindi sinasabi na porque pinirmahan na natin ang isang treaty ngayong taon na to, dapat ura-urada, complied ka na agad. Hindi There are certain qualifications that are considered by the United Nations na sila ang source ng ating mga conventions na ito. Halimbawa, kung kakulangan ng ating pondo, kakulangan ng ating budget para ma-implement ang isang bagay, sinasabi nila na, okay, we understand na it would take you several years para ma-comply ito. But then again, it's very important that at least we see you taking the steps. But then it's also very clear that you know the targets. So depende siya dyan sa ano. Kasi kaya ko na-mention yan dahil we're talking about a huge a wide range of rights na hindi na lamang ito nakatutok sa civil and political rights. Kasi we talk about economic and social rights.
Naging specifics na, no?
Okay, Usec, you mentioned about the monitoring aspects, economic, social rights, then the general human rights. So, do you have statistics pertaining to the different parameters of rights nito?
Sa ngayon, ang talaga nabibigyan pansin, dahil na rin sa ingay talaga ng marami mga sektor, yung civil and political rights. So, we have statistics on disappearances, statistics of torture cases, statistics on... Although, I would like to point out that over the years, our committee has been reaching out to these different sectors.
Okay, for purposes of academic discussion, what is a civic right and what is a political right?
Well...
Ito na naman ang academic. Talaga ito si Dr. Jan, no?
Sige.
Alam mo, academic yan eh. Sige, academic yan eh.
Civil and political rights.
Civil rights and civil rights.
Civil and political rights.
Yeah, civil rights.
Well, Ang civil rights sa aking mababang pagkakaunawa nito ay yung karapatan mo bilang isang tao, na isang member ka ng isang lipunan. Okay. Ang political rights mo naman ay yung karapatan mo kung ikaw ay isang person in authority. Or kaya gusto mo maging kahalubilo sa pag-govern ng isang lipunan. So,
Kasi paano yung nuisance candidate? Right ng isang nuisance candidate tumakbo,
oo. Actually, kaya nga siya nag-run eh.
Oo nga, karapatan niya yun, no? Di ba?
Karapatan niya yun.
Oo.
Kaya alam, may mga qualifications siyempre sa pag-run niya.
Okay.
Kung he creates nuisance in the whole scheme of things, then teka muna. Yung karapatan naman ng iba to have better leaders, yun yung rakan mo na.
Ako, ED, I have issues with the UN naman eh. Ibahin ko lang ng konti,
Sige.
off tangent. The UN is the center of human rights advocacies all around the world to guide, to protect the basic rights of human beings, the 6-7 billion people we have in this world, and being the League of Nations, the United Nations today, is supposed to be the center to create some type of parameter or standard. Wasn't it just 2 weeks ago where the crazy man from Iran just went there, Ahmadinejad, who went to the United Nations? I mean, the United Nations, I mean, let's face it, that's being supported by the United States, not the United Nations itself. They can't even pay rent. Di ba? I mean, no, not for anything. No, naano lang ako sa United Nations because they have such a big voice wherein America, which is the strongest country and the one that supports the United Nations, basically, because the UN really has very little powers. It's like NATO, it's still the US. I mean, let's face it, di ba? The #1 country in the world. And then you've got the 50 African states that have broken up. And they all have one voice each. And here's America, you know, who's supposed to be the #1 country in the world where human rights is such a big issue, di ba? And they have only one vote. Di ba? Parang ganun eh. I mean, it irritates me sometimes that the people in the United Nations speak as if they are the be-it-all, know-it-all, di ba? When they themselves are the ones, well, I don't know. Maybe it's just a stigma on my part. Let's go back to the issues. Q&A tayo. Maganda yung question. Sige.
Pero gustong dagdagan na.
Sige.
I've had a chance to observe the goings on in the UN.
Yes, sir.
For, during our kasi isa sa mga functions kasi ng Presidential Human Rights Committee is that we need to submit regular compliance reports before the specific
You
human
mentioned
rights
mentioned
committees.
compliance. Is it really the real report? Kasi the word compliance is only to report.
Oh, well, ang pag-comply naman dyan is not simply compliance of government.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, well, as a state.
As a state,
But then there are certain functions kasi of civil society that come into the picture. Like for instance, even if the state submits its own report, that does not prevent the different civil society organizations, NGOs.
Pero
to
Usec,
come up with
pero
their
Usec,
own
ganito, in
shadow,
terms of the
parallel reports.
Usec, in terms of the report, the United Nations and the International Human Rights Commissions do always focus on the human rights violations of the military. Palaging ganun. Kasi we have dimensions of human rights, religious rights, political rights, all rights, even educational rights. Pero palaging pinag-uusapan sa lipunan natin yung palaging violation ng military against the insurgents.
I think that's we were seeing as part of the evolutionary process. I think in many of our current human treaty movements, movement in terms of actions, there's already a big recognition of non-state actors as part of the accountable sector. Hindi lamang Estado na ngayon. In fact, yung pinirmahan ng ating Pangulo, yung Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, ay very specific doon na this will also cover even non-state actors. Kasi napakalaking issue yan noon eh. Lalo na sa torture cases. Naalala mo, there was a time na nung lumabas yung anti-torture law, maraming nagreklamong mga dating mga rebelde na sabi nila, teka muna, bakit yung mga dati namin kasamahan na nag-torture sa amin noon, hindi nyo sinama doon. So, dapat non-state actor.
Kaya lang ganito eh. In terms of the anti-torture law, palaging rebelde ang nakikitang biktima ng torture. Paano naman yung militar na tinotorture ng rebelde?
Yes. Actually, yun ang naging gap doon sa anti-torture law na yun. Which slowly, sabi ko nga as part of the evolution, government, the state in partnership with the different CSOs and NGOs are trying to rectify. Kaya nga yung nagiging issue nga dito yung sa Disappearance Act, diba?
Disappearance Act,
yung
Kay
nakakawala.
Burgos, yung nawawala. Jonas Burgos.
Ang sabi nila, kung itutuloy itong batas na ito, dapat kasama rin yung non-state actors kasi meron din mga nawala noong panahon nung
prior.
Na ang gumawa naman ay yung kabila, hindi naman Estado ang gumawa, kundi yung mga non-state. mga NPAs,
Mga
oo.
Tinotorture nila yung sarili nilang kasama.
Yes,
Kasi
oo.
napagkakamalang DPA.
Kasi nagkaroon ng purging kasi noon eh. So sila mismo, during the time of the purging, nagkawalaan yung iba, sabi nila, teka muna. Yung kasama kong nawala nung panahon ng ano, dapat accountable din itong dati kong kasama na pinagsuspetsahan kami.
Mahirap pala itong issue ng human rights,
Pero-
Kasi hindi basta-basta
Oo,
pala ito.
oo.
Ako I'm perplexed with the kind of work that you have to attend to.
Napaka-general ng human rights,
but
Hari.
it's difficult because he has to report to the world community exactly where we stand.
That's correct.
That's your responsibility,
That's our
basically.
responsibility.
Kasi in the different category, you always concentrate only on the human rights violation pertaining to violence, the
That's
torture.
correct, oo.
Pero halimbawa, yung religious rights, meron ba kayong monitoring dyan?
Well, actually, hindi naman natin kailangan i-monitor yan kasi ano naman tayo eh, unlike other countries na may suppression of religious beliefs, tayo very open
Wala,
tayo.
open tayo.
Oo, kahit na bukas magtayo ka ng isang...
I think our problem is we have too much freedoms.
Yeah.
Like democracy, that's what I call it, di ba? Too much freedoms, too much freedoms.
How about yung bagong rights, the LGBT rights, the gay rights?
Well, sabi ko nga, sa akin isang personal matter ito. Hindi yung personal matter. No? Pero I do have many friends in that sector. I think it's part of the evolution. It's part of the evolution of rights. And part ito din ng pag-recognize natin who will benefit from these rights. No? Kasi hindi natin maiwasan yan na nagbabago ang mundo. No? Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na just because nagbago yung kasarian o naging questionable, hindi na siya tao.
Hindi mo pwedeng bago kasarian, di ba? Male tsaka female lang. Sexual preference.
Hindi, nagbago
No, but tama siya, it's an evolving concept that has to be addressed and monitored almost daily. And your reportage is based on the confluence of events that continue to evolve. For example, your question earlier, when we were off camera, what happens, nagbaha.
Nagbaha, yan.
Nagbagsakan yung mga dams.
Yeah.
On hindsight, they shouldn't have opened the dams, but let's go past that. It's already there. So pupuntang military, pupuntang pag-asa, kung sino man, malis na kayo dito. Kundi mababaha kayo dito. Mapapipinsala kayo. Ayaw umalis, bahay ko ito, ganito, ganyan.
Forced evacuation.
Forced evacuation. Human rights.
Tanggalin kita dyan, sumakay ka sa bangka. Tapos
Yan,
papailan ka
di
ng
ba?
human rights
Tas,
secretary.
Ayaw umalis, bigla dinagsangan ng baha, nagkatubig-tubig, hindi sila makawala doon. Ngayon, napinsala sila, now we can't even reach them. But if you force them, human rights. I mean, where does it begin and where does it end? This is my issue with the word human rights. It's perplexing.
Okay.
So much abuse.
Well, meron kasing concept ngayon sa Human Rights Promotion and Protection, which is what we call the HRBA or the Human Rights-Based Approach to Development. Dito sa concept na to, very defined kasi yung yung mga roles, no? Like under this principle, the government is called the duty bearer. So you have a duty. And the citizens, its constituents are called the claim holders. So they have the right to claim. Okay. So kung titignan natin dito sa concept natin ng binaha, yung tao, baha na hanggang liig na ayaw pang umalis. O kaya sabihin lang natin there's a threat na sasabog yung bulkan ngayon.
Correct. Umalis ka na
sa
dyan.
region natin, umalis ka dyan. Kung titignan talaga natin, may karapatan sila sa kanilang property. May karapatan sila na wag umalis. That's there. They can claim that right.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
But the government has a duty to protect its people.
So, government prevails in this case.
Yes, oo. Kasi
Okay.
i-assert na ngayon na I have a duty to protect you.
So whether you like it or not, I'm taking you out of here.
Yes,
because
that's correct.
Kung magka-problema dito, mas malaki problema kung
Mas
kukunin
malaki ang
kita.
problema, oo. Pero may mga qualifications din yan. Like for instance, dapat ang duty ng pamahalaan, kasi in-assert na yung duty niyan,
Yes, yes.
he should make sure that the government make sure as part of its duty na maayos yung paglipat sa kanya, ang pupuntahan niya maayos na lugar, yung kanyang mga ari-arian, kung halimbawa hindi natuloy yung... May guidelines yan. Kasi that's part of being very conscious of its human rights obligation.
So what would be the doctrine to be applied kung halimbawa yung hinila nyo, sabi, papailang kita ng kaso, maraming nawalang gamit, kung di mo ako kinuha, sana dito pa yung mga gamit ko.
Well, that is one of the risks that government have to take, has to take. Oo. Kasi kahit anong gawin mo, may mga ito yung concept na damn if you do, damn if you don't. But somehow you have to take a position. Hindi ka pwede kasi magdili-dali . Parang i-assert mo at some point that you have an authority.
Siguro within that point, isa sa dapat maging function ng Presidential Human Rights Committee is to propose law sa Congress so that those who are implementing and protecting the human rights should be protected also.
That's
through
correct.
their executive secretary, as ED has said. The one who presents for you has to be the CHOA.
Well, under the current executive, under the current administrative order, we're under the Office of the Executive Secretary. But that does not prevent the Office of the Secretary to designating people who will represent him, or defining what will be the operational structure.
Kasi in the revised penal code, meron mga justifying circumstances, exempting circumstances. So, ang problema dito, you could not apply it in terms of that situation. So, we need to expand yung mga circumstances.
Yes, that's
wherein
correct.
would accept somebody because that's protecting the life of somebody, di ba? Yes. So, anong mas magaan? Yung buhay nyo, yung property? Anong importante? Di ba?
Yeah, that's correct. Oh.
Security over safety.
Security over safety.
One of the issues that we discussed with the fire chief, it's the same thing. What comes first? I have, as much as I'm perplexed, I thank you very much for enlightening me on the issues when it comes to human rights. I thought it was clear-cut and simplistic. It's not. There are many attributes to consider, and there are many situations that differ from one country to another and situation to situation. However, the monitoring and the reportage that goes back to the UN and or whatever governing body, I guess has to be a basis of some type of civility, miski papano. That's where it brings us all together as human beings.
Alam mo, Harry, in terms of the legislators, they're concentrating so much on proposing law on anti-human rights violations.
Maybe the President Human Rights Commission, you should sit as a group in Congress to teach these legislators because many of them, well, let's face it, Congress is the grouping of oligarchs.
Kasi we have so many dimensions pertaining to human rights. I remember we have a guest of fire protection and emergency. Halimbawa, ganito nangyari, no? Diyan sa natabunan ng building, naipit yung binte, di ba? So, anong gagawin mo? Do you need to amputate it or not? When you amputate it, baka pailan ng kaso pag namatay. Pero anong uunahin mo? So there are laws that really needs to be enacted. Ang problema, the Congress right now is concentrating on laws to go against the military on anti-human rights violations. Palaging ganun ang direction. So, ang ngayon sinasabi ngayon ni
Don't you
Usec,
take the military into consideration, ED, when you compose reports and analysis and
Yes.
assessments? Di ba? Because you have to, kawawa naman ang militar natin. Di ba? Parang gano'n, no?
kasi we need to grow right now in terms of human rights discussion. We need to evolve. Ang human rights is not just human rights violation. We need to go to the positive aspects. Human rights
Malamang
education.
military nito ni Dr. Jan. But go ahead. Malapit ang puso niya sa military. Malapit yan.
Hindi, pero alam mo ano rin, yung kanyang sinasabi is actually on track on the same wave nung sinasabi natin na part of the evolution on how people should be able to perceive human rights as it is today, no? Kasi sabi ko nga, pinalawak siya, no? Pinalawak talaga siya. In fact, kung makikita natin, ang tanongan natin dito, kung meron bang agenda ang ating administrasyon ngayon sa human rights, kung titingnan natin yung 16-point social contract ni Presidente, yun actually is a human rights agenda in itself. Kasi kung titingnan mo yung in the whole range of rights, right to housing, right to education, kasama yun
Halos
doon
human right nga eh.
Oo.
I agree.
Yun ang ano doon. And it's actually taking us to that level wherein people somehow realize na, teka nga muna, hindi lang pala ito yung kahon na dapat tingnan natin. Kasi we deserve looking at this.
Oh, you mentioned right to education. That's very broad. Gusto ko mag-aral eh. Hindi ako mapag-aral lang sa
Yeah.
Can I file a case against the state?
Well,
for violation of human rights?
Ang titingnan natin diyan kasi, well, tama yun.
Oo.
Pero, yung ating pag-file ng mga kaso before
Hindi, magpera ka muna, bayad ka muna, ano kala mo?
Hindi,
Libre
right
lahat?
to education
Ikaw
eh.
naman. Yan ang problema ng Pilipino, gusto lahat libre. But go ahead.
Masaya pala dito. Hindi, pero pag na ganyan, actually yung ating mga pinirmahan sa UN, somehow it allows yung mechanism na ganyan to file complaint. No? Although may mga sinasabi naman na may mga steps dyan which really allow the process to take off. No? Like we have to sign a protocol just to allow our people to complain. Ano? Kaya lang, ang isang underlying principle naman dyan na titingnan, have we exhausted all the means allowed us in the country? Halimbawa, hindi ka naman pwede magsabi na, let's say, nagkaroon ka ng kaso na hindi inaksyonan dito, tapos mag-file ka agad sa UN. Hindi naman pwede. tatanungin ng UN, teka muna, lahat ba ng legal...
Yung proseso, dinaanan mo
dinaanan
ba?
mo na ba lahat? Oo.
Tama nga naman, tama nga naman.
Inuuna pa rin yung kung ano yung mekanismo na nandito sa atin. Ang nakikita lang kasi namin dito, well, hindi natin na iiwasan din yun at hindi natin ma-prevent, that there are some people, some groups na para mag-create lang ng noise, kahit alam nila na hindi magka-prosper, pipilitin yun.
Kasi ang tawag doon, media value. Ang tawag doon, media value.
You're the PR man, Harry. So,
Ladies and gentlemen, we are reaching the top of the hour. It is obvious in a 1-hour program, it is not enough to discuss the disciplines that come into the study, or how do you say it, human rights. It's just not possible. There are so many aspects to it and so many questions that need to be addressed. However, due process and specific process or guidelines or processes of how things work obviously are a big consideration towards this. You cannot just say, hey, like Dr. John says, I want to study, make me study. Yeah, sure. I want to get tall. I can't get taller. Where's my human rights? I want to be taller. You see, this is what you call the idiocy of some people who don't understand. Now, you who are watching, on the contrary, are there to understand, well, to be part of this process of what we call critical thought. Because this is what we do. We are here supposedly with our responsibility to ignite, to generate that thought inside your mind, so we, as much as we are learning, as we do the show, wish that you learn as well. Anyway, we're at the end of the show, and I'm beginning to not make nonsense because there's so much to learn. And the more I learn, the more I do not know. Diba? Parang ganun lumalabas. But it's true. There's so much to learn and there's so much to understand because people who just scream out and don't know what they're talking about, how easy, ang daling itaas, makibaka, for what? I have no idea, pero sumabay tayo. This is what you call the stupidity of the masses when they start congregating together, not knowing exactly what they're doing. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to end the show, but before we do, I'd like to give the opportunity for our guest, Executive Director, to give a message to our viewers, sir.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor John and Harry.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity of getting us into this place and allowing us to share some of the things that we do. No? What I would like to stress probably is that human rights is very much a part of the administration. It's part of any government. It's part of the administration. No? It's a matter of looking at it, how it has evolved over the years, and how it's actually being applied, and what we can do to be able to be part of the whole circle of human rights advocates and constituents. In fact, I think what we should look into is how can we build an active human rights constituency. It's high time that people should realize that they have rights. And rights are not simply equated to civil and political rights, but it runs the whole gamut of rights that they should be able to assert. And they have a government that is willing to listen to them. Take that opportunity. Create a noise. Go to the mountaintops and shout, no? Para marinig. The government is very much willing to take you up on your causes. Kaya nga meron tayong social reform agenda. We have the social contract of the administration. And this is a major step towards really telling ourselves that, hey, our rights are being addressed, and it's being promoted, and it's being protected.
Thank you very much, Edie. John, your message.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, one thing we learned these days that human rights or karapatang pantao is the most abused word right now in terms of the civil and political rights. And maybe one thing we learn right now in this discussion is that rights have parameters, rights have limitations, ladies and gentlemen. So not all rights are extreme or so absolute, as we say. We need to look at the concept of what a right really is. So ang karapatang pantao po ay depende po yan sa pananaw ng bawat tao at titignan po natin kung ano ang limitasyon ng bawat karapatang ito. Ang problema po minsan, and the problem is that most of our constituents and even most groups right now are looking at the abusing of the term rights and human rights per se. So one thing for sure, as we say, everything has limitations and everything has parameters, and part of it are human rights. That's it, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed our program. I guess if it's one thing that remains constant, it's change. And with change comes evolution, which is why we have people knowledgeable who come and sit with us and take their time out. Thank you very much, Executive Director,
you're welcome.
who have taken time out to help us all understand the evolution of what we call human rights. We take it so easily. It's like parang baliwala. But do we know what it is? Do we understand it? Obviously, well, I thought I did, and I'm always talking politics. Obviously, I've come to realize in this past hour, the discipline is ever-changing and considerations are always being injected. So in other words, what we know or what we think we know now, the more we realize, as Plato said, we do not know. Maraming salamat po. My name is Harry Tambuatco. Stay with us. There's more for you right here on GNN. Thank you very much, sir.
You are what you watch.